Well, it's that time of year again, the end of the year, and oh, what a glorious year 2016 was. At least for video games. We're not here to talk about the rest. I was absolutely amazed at the sheer number of fantastic titles that we got to play this year. For some reason, the game industry decided it didn't want to completely suck for 12 months and actually got pretty consistent, both on the indie and AAA side of things, in just about every genre you can think of. Okay, I guess Nintendo had a pretty dry year, but even the few hits they put out were pretty awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to celebrate. I have once again put together my top games of the year, this time in a list of 10 to share with all of you. Unfortunately, I couldn't fit everything I wanted to in this video, but I think that's just a testament to how good it all was. As a rule, I won't be considering remasters for this list, nor games that launched as exclusives in the past but hit all other platforms at some point this year. If it was first playable at some point in the year 2016, then it's eligible. Let's get this show on the road! Yearly series tend not to get a lot of respect, even if they do sell like hotcakes. Whether it's Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, or even this year's football roster update, just about anyone with some depth to their gaming library tend to scoff at these games and turn the other way. Except if that series happens to be called Pokemon, which for some reason tends to get away with it. While technically the franchise bucked the trend with a one-year break after Omega Rehash and Alpha Sham Fire. Yeah. Pokemon returned in a big way this year with Sun and Moon, a game that, for the first time in, well, ever, did a lot to actually shake things up for the series. I'll admit I was heavily skeptical right up until release, but as it turns out, Sun and Moon ended up being the most fun I've had with the series in nearly a decade. A lot of emphasis this time was placed on a very cohesive and somewhat adult narrative that really took me by surprise. Rather than trying to constrain so much of the story to fit its gameplay, it actually did the complete opposite. For just about the entirety of the game, the pacing is on point and keeps everything very engaging. And it ramped up the difficulty quite a lot, putting actual strategy and mechanics into the many island trials that have now replaced the long-standing series tradition of gym battles. I could say it took a little too long for the series to pose a threat, but I think I'm pleasantly surprised enough to say better late than never. Now, I should mention this game almost didn't make the list. The first 2 hours of the game are insufferably slow, with lots of hand-holding, and the endgame is frankly atrocious, with monotonous questing and all of the game's best items locked behind a frankly worse version of the Battle Tower from Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. But that's the thing. Sun and Moon is a gourmet sandwich that Game Freak decided to make with moldy bread. Once you peel off the bread, there's something wonderful in there. I've said many a time that I do have a fascination and appreciation for artistic games, provided they aren't pretentious and manage to be at the very least fun or engaging. One of my all-time favorite games, and my 2012 Game of the Year, is one of the shining examples of the artistic genre, and that's Journey. Many people know it as a walking or sand simulator. Whatever you want to call it, it was a darn good experience with beautiful visuals, storytelling, and excessively charming gameplay. So when I heard the guy responsible for Journey's amazing graphics went on to start up his own project, I was intrigued. That project would later be known as Abzu, with striking similarities to Journey in almost all aspects save for the setting. A lot of people criticized Abzu for borrowing too much from the previous game, but personally, if it's only the second game in a frankly untapped style, I don't see how it can wear out its welcome, because everything is executed perfectly. The gameplay is just as satisfying, if not more so, due to the increased speed. The underwater setting does perfect to highlight just how gorgeous the visuals are, and there's just as much emotional attachment and investment as before. Abzu may not have struck the exact same chords again as Journey did, but I chalked it up entirely to it having come later. Nothing about it is lacking in emotion and mechanics. It's simply another amazing experience. As many of you who've watched my channel over the last few years may know, I do like my share of racing games. And I'm not just talking about Mario Kart. I do enjoy racing games with actual cars, but I like it when they have a little personality to them. One of my favorite games of all time is Midnight Club 3, thanks to its open world, fast pace, and non-traditional track types, as opposed to the Gran Turismos and Need for Speeds of the world. Midnight Club isn't really around anymore, but another series that just about scratches that same itch for open world racing is the Forza Horizon series. While the series is a bit more focused on visual fidelity and realism than Midnight Club was, as opposed to the more arcade elements, it still does a fine job of being just a lot of fun. and this year's Forza Horizon 3 is no exception. With an extremely unique Australian outback setting, tons of amazing cars, varied gameplay, and well, just a heck of a lot to do, Forza Horizon 3 has more than held my interest for more hours than most of the games on this list. It's a lot of fun, racing aside. The different little challenges, all the exploration that can be done, heck, racking up skill combos is actually an incredibly fun thing to do here, and I typically can't stand games that use that as a focus. I'd be lying if I said anything about this year's Forza absolutely blew me away, aside from maybe a few of the graphical elements, but I can safely say it's been a consistently and extremely enjoyable experience through and through. And to anyone with an interest in speed, cars, or both, I highly recommend you check this game out. At the beginning of 2016, most of the biggest AAA releases turned out to be lackluster at best, and pretty terrible at worst, so it was up for indies to steal the show. And they sorta did. The Witness, Pony Island, and Stardew Valley were all huge successes in their own right. But if there was one game that stood far and above the rest, it has to be Firewatch. While marketed as, and I emphasize the air quotes in this one, just another walking simulator with a touch of humor, it actually turned out to be a lot more. Well, yes, technically much of the gameplay revolves around simply walking from place to place, Firewatch is a game that evokes storytelling, atmosphere, and immersion in a way that almost no other game before it has quite been able to achieve. The characters, for one, are incredibly likable, and there's just two. Henry, our fearless protagonist, and his boss Delilah, both of whom start the game with very fierce personalities that continuously evolve into something very human. We learn about these characters all while experiencing different events that the game does an amazing job of conveying as beautiful and surreal when really it's incredibly normal. And that's what makes Firewatch such a good experience from start to finish. It celebrates life, its every up and down, the humor and the tragedy, all while keeping things relatively down to earth. And it's something I can't say I've ever seen or even heard of a video game doing before. The gameplay itself is nothing to write home about, but if you have 4 or 5 hours, you owe it to yourself to go on this unforgettable adventure. Guns, 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 shooty, shooty guns. Of course we have to have all manner of first-person shooters toward the end of the year. That's just how video games work. Call of Duty and Battlefield duking it out for Game of the Year for a bunch of people who don't actually know what video games are and would rather just shoot stuff for the sake of stimulation. Meanwhile, a few rows back, another first-person shooter in somewhat the same vein reared its head, but was sort of shoved into the background while these two big-budget and mediocre at best shooters stole the spotlight. And I gotta say, that might be the biggest shame of 2016, when it comes to video games at least. I went into Titanfall 2 with relatively low expectations. While I never got to experience the first game due to its player base dropping off the face of the earth a full year before I even got an Xbox One, the second game still didn't leave me too excited, aside from the prospect of there being an actual campaign this time. Granted, Call of Duty and Battlefield campaigns tend to be mostly garbage too, and yeah, like I said, the bar was low. But what amazed me was, not only did Titanfall 2 leap the bar, it friggin' shot the moon and landed a bullseye. The campaign is awesome. Every character is a whole lot of fun, especially your Titan. There are a lot of cliches, but they're very fun cliches. The combat and the environments are awesome. The mechanics are so great. There's a certain level in particular that I dare not spoil that just had me giggling from start to finish. And to top it all off, even the multiplayer is fantastic. While I will admit the Titan gameplay itself isn't my favorite, it's still really a lot of fun, and I think as accessible as one can get for mech-based gameplay these days. But the pilot gameplay is what's outstanding. So much mobility and verticality, it's just a constant thrill ride, and I love it, love it, love it. While I wouldn't call anything here addicting, the campaign alone was almost worth the entry fee for me. The multiplayer easily sealed the deal, and the only true negative I can find is that EA marketed Battlefield 1 over this. Shame on you, EA. Shame on you. "2016 had a lot of surprises in store for me, much like Titanfall 2 before this, and I think for a lot of other people as well. A lot of games that people would have never thought twice about at first glance ended up becoming all-time favorites. I had a couple of those, but of all the games that came out of literally nowhere and ended up blowing me away, It was Fury. I saw the first trailer for this game mere weeks before it launched, and PlayStation gave it away as the free game of the month back in July. And I gotta say, it's one of the most satisfying games I've ever played. Fury is a top-down hack-and-slash bullet hell combination of a game that doubles as a boss rush. Just 9 bosses and you, all with their own unique mechanics that build on top of each other. The game is challenging for sure, and beating it was an accomplishment in its own right. But more important was just how punchy, responsive, and downright enjoyable that gameplay is. It's so fast, so quick, so friggin' fun. You'll play the entire game on pins and needles, exercising every twitch reflex you have to master dodging, parrying, and making the most of the small openings each boss gives you. And the bosses themselves are amazing, a few of them easily becoming some of my all-time favorite boss battles in gaming history. This is like Shadow of the Colossus for someone on Adderall, and I love it. No, I'm not implying anything. And then there's the music and the art direction. All of it meshes so well with the gameplay, stays relatively simplistic, yet maintains its own flavor of uniqueness. I can't help but fall in love. Fury is not a game for the faint of heart for sure, but if you're up for it, it's one heck of a recommendation from yours truly. Going into this year, there were a few really huge titles that people were anticipating the most, and I think it's safe to say that one of the biggest, if not the biggest, was the final chapter in the Uncharted series, especially after so many delays. It's finally here, and as a massive fan of the series myself, I can safely say it was great. Not the best, but great. Of course, all the elements of Uncharted are there, from the fun story to the amazing set pieces, to the insane platforming, the little puzzles, enjoyable gameplay, and everything in between. Every element of what makes an Uncharted game so fantastic is there, and of course there are big improvements. The visuals obviously, as well as the responsiveness of the game were fine-tuned, plus actual stealth mechanics that actually meant something as opposed to the half-assed stealth mechanics from the previous games. Heck, I even thought the gunplay was a bit better, and I know I'm in the minority on that. My only beef with Uncharted 4 was the distribution of each of those elements in a way that made it feel a little less like an Uncharted game. As the series went on, everything got bigger, everything got more fast-paced, even if it wasn't always to the game's benefit. I'm looking at you, Drake's Deception. It still tried to ramp things up. Uncharted 4 definitely has a much more subdued tone. While sure there are crazy moments of climbing up a collapsing tower or sprinting across rooftops, it almost felt like we were back to the first game, but with a much better story. Because that's where the focus was placed. Much of Uncharted 4's development was under the wing of the same team that made The Last of Us, and it really shows. I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, because I adore that game too, but the focus of story over everything else actually sorta hurts what makes Uncharted Uncharted. The story was always there, and you cared about the characters, sure, but it never overshadowed the adventure, or the moments of pure, raw action, or the levels of cheese. In Uncharted 4, it kinda did. This is by no means a huge complaint, as it's still a fantastic game. It just feels a little less Uncharted, and I think I like it a little less as a result, but just a little. This is still an adventure absolutely worth going on. These characters are still as wonderful as ever, and it really is a blast all throughout. I can't recommend it enough. But would I play it over and over to my heart's content like I would Uncharted 2? Not quite. There was one other game that was being hyped up going into this year about as much as Uncharted 4, but more than likely not by the same crowd of people. And I'll admit, I wasn't in that crowd. I had heard things here and there, but it wasn't until I actually got to try out the first open beta for consoles that I got to finally play around with Overwatch. And boy, am I glad I did. Everyone knows what Overwatch is now, a PvP team-based game centered around heroes, each one filling specific roles in order to win the objective. What can I say that hasn't already been said about Overwatch? The gameplay is awesome. Each and every hero is unique and enjoyable to play in their own way. So many different first-person mechanics meshing into one game of strategy, or chaos depending on which you prefer. The support for the game has been phenomenal, with new maps, modes, and heroes being added on a relatively consistent basis, all for free. The cosmetics are somewhat fun to collect, but I'd have to say the microtransaction system is the game's one pretty big inherent downfall. But it does make up for it in spades. It's a blast to play with friends on all levels of skill, but none of that is why it's at number 3. Or at least, almost none of that. The biggest and most absolute reason I love this game so much has everything to do with its characters. Every single one of them is so likable, so unique, so charming, and so colorful. Each one stands out as some of the most memorable characters in gaming history. So much love and care has been crafted into their personalities, their designs, and their lore in a game that, despite its very serious and emotional backstory, radiates hope. Overwatch is a good game. It's a great game. But above all, it's a wonderful world that exudes happiness and charm, and it's one I never want to leave. I say this with a surety that number 3 seems a bit too high for this game on my list, but the lore and the atmosphere of this game alone has kept me all but glued to it since before its launch, and it really has taken up most of my 2016. I'd say that's more than enough reason for it to deserve the number 3 spot. So, I've tried to keep this list mostly, if not entirely fair in my criticism of each game, showcasing the reasons I loved each of these games, but also highlighting a couple things amiss. And while I'm going to do that with this entry as well, I can't deny that I have deliberately put this game a lot higher on this list than it probably deserves to be. But I'm sorry, for all of its faults, there was no game this year that impacted me in quite the same way as The Last Guardian did. Everyone was waiting for a very, very long time for this game, and I was among the most die-hard crowd. I waited with bated breath from the first day we got a whiff of the third game from Team Ico back in 2007. More than 9 years later, and I gotta say, I wasn't disappointed in the slightest. The game certainly has its problems, with much of the gameplay and controls not really improving over the last game in the series from 11 years ago. There are a couple AI hiccups, and even some minor bugs. Yet with just a tiny bit of patience and a unique sense of awe and curiosity, I loved every single second of it. So much so, I beat the game twice in the span of 4 days, just to make sure I wasn't in some sense of denial or whatever. I love these characters. I love the puzzles. I love the atmosphere. I love the music. I love the themes it explores, and I love the visuals. And the ending that I won't spoil actually beats out Uncharted 4 for my favorite ending to any game this year. It was all simply wonderful, and I want to keep going back for more. As it stands, this is the end of a beautiful series of games that changed the face of video games forever, with Ico inspiring most of the biggest indie titles today, and Shadow of the Colossus setting the bar for epic moments told through gameplay rather than cutscenes. The Last Guardian has set another bar, and that's characterization, specifically without words. Sure, there's a little dialogue here and there, but those are honestly the least impactful moments of the game. It's the expressions, the emotions, and the moments themselves that make you fall in love with this boy and this creature. And by the end, everything and anything that happens to them tugged at my heartstrings. I adore this game, yet I have to say, I can't recommend it to everyone. It is frustrating at times, especially when you know exactly what to do, but without some persistence, you might think you're doing the wrong thing when it's really the right thing. This game rewards patience, but it rewards it greatly. Every single accomplishment really felt like one, and it did all the more to make every facet of this game so memorable to me. I wanted to put it at the number 1 spot, I really did. But this year was just so good, there happens to be one game better.
I'm willing to take full responsibility for the horrible events of the last 24 hours, but you must understand. Our interest in their world was purely for the betterment of mankind. Everything has clearly gotten out of hand now, yes. But it was worth the risk, I assure you.
Doom is awesome. I think you may have heard that enough already by now, but I want to emphasize it that much more. Doom is awesome. Easily one of the biggest surprises of 2016, especially with a lack of review codes, a pretty poor multiplayer beta, and a lot of additionalist skepticism prior to launch. The odds were not in Doom's favor, but I have to say, I have not had so much damn fun from start to finish playing a video game. Ever. The campaign is a true masterpiece. From the second you start, you're kicking demon faces in. Within a couple of minutes, you're given one of the better weapons in the game, and it only ramps up from there. For several hours, it never stops being the literal essence of fun. Taking on hordes of demons, executing countless glory kills that do nothing to stop the flow of the action, and even enhance it. Collecting an arsenal of weapons with tons of fantastic upgrades, each of which might be considered the best gun in the game in any other shooter. There is no limit to the cheese. It plays out like one of the best 80s action flicks while simultaneously remaining very self-aware. The story is actually brilliant. All of the characters are pretty cliche in their own right, but it works because of the protagonist. He's angry, he's tough, he's a brute, and yet he's the smartest person in the room, amidst all these other people that think they're the smartest person in the room. Your own enemies are actually terrified of the protagonist, with in-game lore even suggesting how they cower at the thought of you, and only attack in desperation simply to be rid of you. And the game is suitable at all levels, from a walk in the park to ball-crushingly hard, and that's before you unlock 2 even harder difficulties. The level design is also genius, encouraging exploration not with poking and prodding, but because it gives you so many reasons to want to do it. It rewards you by allowing you to become more badass, and who doesn't want to be more badass? What more can I say? This game is a verifiable masterpiece from start to finish in almost every aspect of its gameplay. Oh yeah, there's multiplayer too, and it's pretty great, especially with all the additions that id Software has made since launch. The Snap Map feature is also a lot of fun, encouraging loads of creativity. It's all good, but I got more than my money's worth from the campaign alone, and I bought the game at full price. Doom is not only my game of the year, but as of right now, it's the best game I've played this console generation, bar none. I simply cannot recommend it enough.